5 Outdoors is sponsored by Arkansas Game and Fish Commission.
Good to see everybody right here on 5 News Plus for another edition of 5 Outdoors. This week, Ducks Unlimited, an organization in which many folks that live around here are a part of or certainly familiar with, issued an urgent call to their membership, waterfowl conservationists and duck hunters alike. It's complex, but we have two of the experts in the field joining us here on 5 News Plus today to kind of talk about what a potential rule change could look like, and if perhaps that gives you the same concern that they have, how you can potentially speak up. Dr. Mike Brazier is a senior waterfowl scientist at Ducks Unlimited, as well as Dr. Scott Stevens. Both, of course, you can hear on the Ducks Unlimited podcast. Gentlemen, let's make some sense of this complex government rule change and the impact it could have locally here in Arkansas and Oklahoma.
There is a fair bit here. The first thing that I will say is that what's at play here is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is reviewing a process by which they help determine setbacks for drain tile around wetland easements up in the Prairie Pothole Region. We also know that they have released a document that indicates their intention to repeal that it's considered or sort of referred to as a 2024 rule that codified that process. So that's what's at play here. Is there is a rule in place that the Fish and Wildlife Service uses and a process that it relates to that lays out the guidelines by which landowners can install drain tile in proximity to wetlands that have on them these conservation easements. U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service held conservation easements, not just any conservation easement, but ones that were purchased with dollars through the purchase of duck stamps from hunters, generations of hunters all across the country. These are wetlands that are up in the Prairie Pothole region, the duck factory, vital for producing ducks that we all enjoy every fall and providing a whole bunch of other resources and benefits. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has provided a brief opportunity for people to comment and let them know, to share our thoughts on whether we believe this is a good idea. In terms of revisiting this rule, Ducks Unlimited's opinion on this, and we have reviewed this closely, and we have some experience with how it's working out. We think the current rule on the books is a good one, and we're asking people to help us support that rule and keeping it in place. Otherwise, we fear we may end up with some weaker protections for some of those wetlands.
Let me ask a very basic question, just in case we have someone that just maybe is struggling to keep up. Let's start with the basic premise of what an easement looks like in this context, and why and how somebody would have entered into one of these easements however many years ago.
Yeah, I'll take a crack at that, Scott. So some history on these easements. You know, we've had duck stamps that you had to purchase if you were going to waterfowl hunt in the U.S. since 1934. The proceeds from hunters purchasing those stamps goes into a dedicated fund that has then been used to purchase habitat to benefit waterfowl. And in the early years, the focus of that would have been fee title acquisitions for things like refuges and waterfowl production areas. But then in the early 60s, the Fish and Wildlife Service received authority to begin purchasing these limited conservation easements. And conservation easements in general can run the gamut from very restrictive and taking away all the rights to development and do much of anything on the property to a very limited number of restrictions. These Fish and Wildlife Service easements are more in that latter category, where in this case, the easement restricts the right to drain, fill, burn, or level these wetlands in the Prairie Pothole region. Currently, the estate that we're talking about that's represented by these easements is about 1.5 million acres. So it's a pretty big chunk, and it's an area that we sort of had considered protected forever and, you know, in the win column as far as habitat for waterfowl. So as the service negotiates these with individual landowners, they show up, say, okay, tell us what the restrictions are. The service relays that, you know, you can't drain the wetlands. If those wetlands go dry, they can farm through those areas. But that is kind of the limitations. The detail in the language says something to the effect of you cannot drain by ditching or by any other means direct or indirect. So that's a key phrase in there that we'll refer to a bit later. But these have been going on a while. We still see landowners showing up to take part in these. They're still attractive. The payment, just to give you a bit of an idea of what the payment is on a per acre basis, it's about 80% of the fee title value on these wetlands. And in North Dakota right now, that's about $2,400 per acre that landowners receive for the acres of wetland that they're protecting forever. So one-time payment, perpetual protection, that's kind of what easements are about in this context.
So taking one chunk at a time, just making sure I'm not taking anything for granted. We're talking about acreage in what we call the Prairie Pothole Region, not in Arkansas, not in Oklahoma, but way up north, upper Midwest.
Right.
That's so critical because why?
Yeah, so this is the geography that is the primary place that most of the ducks breed, especially when we talk about mallards, pintails, gadwall, blue-winged teal, northern shovelers. Those dabbling ducks, we would also include canvasback and redheads in there, but this is the location in the north that those birds go to breed each year, and it would represent, on average, nearly 2/3 of the total breeding ducks that we have on the continent of North America would be represented in that Prairie Pothole region.
So this rule change would maybe allow, what's our concern? What's the fear that might happen should this rule change actually proceed?
Yeah, I think the concern is that, right now the language in those easements says no drainage, essentially. You can't impact these wetlands. And it mentions drain tile specifically. That's something, that's an agronomic practice that has been around for a while, but is fairly new to come to the Prairie Pothole region, especially the part of that geography that has most of the acres of these wetland easements. That really started happening in the, late 2010s, early 2020, and the Fish and Wildlife Service had put out a sort of an administrative memo in 2020 that was the start of how they were going to handle this. That translated into this 2024 rule. And essentially what they had to figure out is, we've got all these easements that say we can't drain, and now we have drainage tile, which, removes subsurface moisture, allows crops to be more productive, but if not installed in the right way, it can also intercept water that would have ended up in the wetlands. So you end up with wetlands that are less full, less acres of wetlands than they would have been naturally. So the service had to figure out, how do we handle that? How do we make sure we're in line with the language in our agreement of no drainage? They brought in some scientists with expertise in hydrology, got information from research and developed these hydrologic formulas that are used to help say how far from the wetland and how deep can the tile be installed so that there's no impact on the wetland. And the two factors that are important in that are the depth of the tile relative to the elevation of the wetland, and then they call it lateral distance. How far from the wetland have you moved back before you install the tile? So that's really what we're talking about here. The concern is, we believe the current rule uses the best available science to ensure that there's no drainage, that there aren't impacts on these protected wetlands that are part of that easement estate, that's part of the National Wildlife Refuge System, and that hunters have paid for 92 years. So that's why we think the rule is pretty good. The other thing that the rule does and put in place, as Mike mentioned earlier, it said provides a clear process for landowners to go through to ensure they're in compliance with the clause in their easement agreement. So because this is, each tract is assessed individually because the topography is different and the soils are different, and those hydrologic formulas behave differently in that context. The producer comes, they make a map specifically for their tract of land. And then if they follow the guidelines that the service provides, they are held harmless, or there's a safe harbor is the term used, that, they'll be sort of held harmless if, the calculations were wrong or something happened later and there was impact to those wetlands. So, as a rule, we think about those kind of things too. Does it provide clarity to landowners? Does it provide, a clear process? Does it sort of hold them harmless from liability downstream if they follow the rules? And it does all of those things. So, that's why we think it's good. Still upholds the clause in the easements of no drainage, which is important for, waterfowl and wetland dependent birds and a whole bunch of other things, but also fair to the ag producers out there.
So you said something there that struck a personal chord with me, and I'm wanting you to maybe expand a little bit. This is something that hunters have paid for generationally, and now all of a sudden, decades later, maybe we're going to turn an about face. Can you say more about what you mean by duck hunters generationally paying for this?
Yeah, well, we said these easements have been purchased since the early 60s. So, what is that? 60 some years, the funds from that migratory bird stamp have been invested in these kind of things. So, now we have 1.5 million acres of that. And yeah, the analogy that I've used, Scott, is, we feel like this is kind of, we would characterize that easement estate, that 1.5 million acres, as sort of a habitat 401k, if you will, that duck hunters have invested in. Now, what do we get for annual returns? We get birds flying south every fall, right? Mallards come to Arkansas, gadwall come down there. And we feel like the question now is, would you guys be okay if we took some of the principal out of your 401k? And that's a pretty easy answer for me as a duck hunter. It's like, heck no. We made that investment. The deal was these were perpetual investments, and that's what we bought and paid for. So no, stay away from our principal. This is important. This is an asset base that we've invested in, and that's why we're saying the rule needs to stay to protect that base and the deal you cut with duck hunters over the past 92 years.
I love that analogy. And as you're kind of describing this, I'm reminded that it's not just duck hunters who buy duck stamps. There are plenty of other folks that are making that same investment. And along those same lines, Dr. Brazier, would you talk more about how this impacts other species besides just waterfowl?
Sure. The one thing I want to emphasize, building off of what Dr. Stevens said there just a minute ago, is that these easements are voluntary. These are not, it's not a mandatory program that a landowner or anyone has to sign up for. These are voluntary agreements that they willingly enter into. Scott said that the language is pretty clear on what is allowed. That's a promise that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and that landowner entered into. And it's a promise that that landowner is sort of by extension making to duck hunters, with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service sort of acting as that intermediary. And so that's a really important thing to me. And Scott's analogy of it being sort of a habitat 401k is a perfect one. And it's not just ducks. You're right. It's all the other songbirds that utilize these small prairie wetlands as they fill up as they have vegetation around the edges. If you ever go to one of these prairie landscapes and you hear the chorus of bird calls around that landscape during the spring and summer, they're dependent upon those prairie wetlands. If you're a fan of invertebrates, pollinators, butterflies, dragonflies, any of those wetland-dependent sort of, I think in some way, charismatic insects, those wetlands, the vegetation, the integrity, the water holding capability of those basins is critical to the life that it provides to those species. We can get outside the sort of biological realm and talk about the water quality benefits that those basins provide, whether we're talking removing excess nutrients, whether we're talking water holding capability that reduces the risk of downstream flooding after intense storms. These things do go dry naturally quite a bit. And that's the other thing we haven't really emphasized, that a lot of these are pretty shallow and they will dry naturally pretty quick. But if drain tile is too close to them, it accelerates the movement of that water out of those basins. They don't hold that water as long and as effectively, and so you get a more quick movement of that water off of the landscape into the ditches, streams, rivers, and it accelerates and elevates the risk of downstream flooding. So there's a host of benefits that these wetlands provide beyond just what we think and talk about most, and that being the ducks that it provides and helps fly south. And that's why other organizations, bird conservation organizations that don't have a heavy hunter base, are big advocates for the purchase of duck stamps. And whether we're talking Nature Conservancy, Audubon, Cornell, a lot of the joint ventures that are out there, everyone has looked at the duck stamp as this sort of gold standard of what conservation should look like. You purchase the stamp, 98 cents out of every dollar goes, some of it goes to these easements, voluntary easements that protect these habitat values forever. It's a pretty cool thing. And now we're really scared that we might lose some of those protections, might lose some of those habitat values. And we're asking people to take action and let the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service know your thoughts. The key action, Scott, I guess maybe this is a good time to sort of lay that out. The Fish and Wildlife Service is asking people to comment on this process by which they allow these drain tiles to be installed near wetlands. And it's a 2024 rule, and that's on the books, and we think it's a good one, and we want the Fish and Wildlife Service to keep it on the books. Ducks Unlimited has established a website, ducks.org/save the duck factory, where you can learn a bit more about this topic. You can also find a link that will take you directly to the Federal Register, where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is asking for your thoughts. Again, the key points as we see it is that this rule is good for the landowner, it's good for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, it's good for the conservationists that have invested in this asset, and we think the Fish and Wildlife Service should not repeal it, and we think they should keep it on the books.
Now, it sounds like that opportunity to actually make a comment is pretty brief. When's the deadline?
It is, Scott. It is, the deadline is Friday. It's a week from today. What is that date? We had a 14-day comment period, so August 7th is the deadline for comment. So yeah, you don't have a whole lot of time, but we're trying to make it available, make it easy to do so. If you are on social media and follow Ducks Unlimited, I'm sure you've seen a lot of our calls to action. That's where you can find some information, but you can also find it at www.ducks.org/save the duck factory.
You know, one of the things that I noticed when this call to action went out is that it stood out. It was a bit more urgent than anything else I've seen in recent years from Ducks Unlimited. Could you say more just about what you own personally, Phil? You're both duck hunters, you're both scientists and conservationists. Maybe take the Ducks Unlimited hat off just for a second and just give me your own personal thoughts.
I'll try to do this. I'll try not to get emotional, because I tell you, each passing day, and I hear more stories and more energy from people that want to help with this, it's really, it really does get me emotional to know how strongly people feel about this resource, how much they share our passion for healthy landscapes, healthy duck populations, and doing it the right way. Again, that's why I go back to this. This is a beautiful program. You buy a duck stamp, 98% of that money goes to fund voluntary conservation easements that are supposed to keep that habitat there forever. That's what we've been told. They're supposed to keep that promise. And everybody realizes that. That's the thing. Like this, we have DU Expo this weekend. Just this morning I was there, and I had several people come up to me from these outdoor industries and say, "Hey, Dr. Mike, how can we help? We want to put this out on our channel. We want to bring attention to this. This is important." I mean, this isn't just a Ducks Unlimited scientist, conservationist, biologist thing, and it's not just hunters either. So many of our other staff here in the building that aren't hunters but are passionate about conservation have asked us for details on this because they want to understand it. And it really is moving to know that there is such support for these assets, for good habitat. And there's so much support for wanting to help us get the message out and try to get the Fish and Wildlife Service to realize that, you know, as American people, we value the thing that they're overseeing, and we want them to keep doing it.
Dr. Stevens, you're in that area. Now, Dr. Mike's based in Memphis, but you live right kind of in this same area we're talking about. What would it mean for you to be driving down the back roads one day and just see something look a little bit different as a result of this rule change?
Yeah, well, Scott, that's a good question. I mean, I'm getting to the age where now I start to reflect too. You know, it's like I've been buying duck stamps for 30 some years, and one of the things that strikes me in this is, there are generations before us, like my grandfather's generation and my father's generation who made this investment and helped build that asset base, right? Like it wouldn't be 1.5 million acres if it was just based on, the contributions of my generation. So this is a multi-generational investment, and I'll admit I feel a little responsibility to, make sure that that investment doesn't go away on my watch. It's sort of our turn to be on guard for these things, and that's what I'd say to the other duck hunters. It's your responsibility to stand up. Generations ahead of us made this investment, and they would expect us to be sure it's still there. So.
Yeah, well said. Well, gentlemen, I really appreciate your time today. I know it's not only busy because you got a big expo at Memphis, but you've also got this fight ahead of you. We appreciate you joining us here, giving us some insight as to what it could look like and how we can actually join you in the fight. You want to give me that
Thank you
website
so
one more
much,
time?
Scott. Absolutely. How do you want to do this, Scott? You're going to edit this together?
You go, Mike. You go.
Okay. Absolutely. That website is www.ducks.org/save the duck factory.
Perfect. Dr. Mike Brazier, Dr. Scott Stevens, Ducks Unlimited. You guys are experts in the field. We know we are privileged to have some time with you today. So we'll get back to work, let you guys get back to work, and maybe we'll visit soon. Maybe talk about fall flight or something before season.
Let's do it.
All right. Y'all take care.
That sounds great.